HTML forms allows you to define form on your web page. This is just the usual form you use online, like the Google form, questionnaire, contact form, or some sort of registration form. So if you need to define a form on HTML web page, it's as simple as just adding a new tag called form. Let's see how that works. So I'm going to open my VS Code the usual way. This is the folder, then this is my file. So I can open this folder with VS Code. Then I'll just do some sort of cleanups. Then we have an empty page. Then forms are defined with the form tag, that is FOR, then the form. So within the opening and closing tags, this is where we define the different fields that we have. So the first one is fields are usually attached to labels. So if you're going to ask someone to fill in their first name, you want to have a label for that particular first name. So we're going to have label tag. So there's a label tag, which within the opening and closing tag, you can type in whatever label you want. For example, in our case, we're going to have the first name. So the for is actually used to target which particular input this label is made for. But before we put in what the for is, let's have the input. So there are different input types in HTML forms. Among them are the text input, which allows you to type in a single line text. Then we also have the radio input type, which display a radio button for selecting one of many choices. There is also checkbox, which allows you to check a number of options. Then there is another input type, which is the submit type. This is the one that actually gives you the button to click. For example, you want to click submit. So this input type gives you the submit button. There is another input type called button. So this button may not necessarily submit that form, but it's just a button that is there that JavaScript can be used on it to do some other actions we want it to do. So going back to our code, if you look at all of these input types, which one do we need to use for our specific need? It is the text input type. So we're going to have our input, which is a text of type text. Now the name of this input is very important. This is when you submit the form and the form is sent to a particular server behind the scene. So the server will recognize this particular input with whatever name you put in here. So we're going to make the name to be first name. Then the ID is the identifier for this particular input. As I have mentioned in some of the videos in the past lessons, that ID should be unique on a page. So in this case, we need to have our ID to be first name. That means if you have another input, you shouldn't add ID to be first name again. So because we already have our name to be first name and ID to be first name, so this label is actually for first name. So we can put in the value in there. So let's save the page and see how it looks like on our browser. So I'm going to open the folder, then navigate to the browser. Here you have our form. This is the label. Then this is the input, which allows you to type in anything you want to type. Now, let's move on to add some other inputs and labels. Because this label is by the side, I want it to stand on its own. I can just wrap this in a paragraph tag. You are very familiar with the paragraph tag. So let's reload the page. Now we have this on the first page, on the first line, the input on the second line. Now let's add another input. So we have a p tag. Then within it we have a label. So the label is going to be last name, and then we have our input of type text. where the name should be last name, and then we have the ID to be the last name. Now let's save this form and reload the page. We have another one. Finally, let's add the submit button. So just like we have seen in W3 School, you can have an input of type submit. Then the value of the submit button will be submit. So if you want to put in anything like register, login, reset password, so this value is where you change all of that. You can see we have our submit button. If I change the submit to, say for example, save, and I reload the page, then you have save. Now what happens when we save the page? Let's try to save the page on this file. If I save, or let me type in the first name, the last name, and save. So you can see nothing happens, but if you look at the URL, you will see that our form data has been appended to the URL. The first name is equal to this, and the last name is equal to this. So how do we process this? Or why is our information that we put in here showing in the URL? Isn't this bad for security? We will see this in the next